This episode is sponsored by FX's Kindred, the original series only on Hulu. Based on Octavia E. Butler's best-selling novel, FX's Kindred centers on Dana James, a young Black woman and aspiring writer. Dana begins to settle into her new home in Los Angeles and is violently pulled back and forth in time. She emerges at a 19th century plantation and is confronted with secrets she never knew ran through her blood. FX's Kindred, all episodes now streaming only on Hulu.
This episode is brought to you by Best Buy. Whether you're searching for exciting gifts or trying to snag the hottest holiday deals, Best Buy is here to help. From air fryers for the aspiring foodies in your life to smartwatches your fitness friends will love, Best Buy is your gifting destination for everyone on your list. And Best Buy makes it easy to get your gifts how and when you need them, with free next-day delivery on thousands of items, as well as same-day delivery and in-store pickup options. Shop great deals on gifts now at Best Buy.
The following podcast contains explicit language.
Hi, I'm Josh Levin, Slate's national editor, and this is Hang Up and Listen for the week of December 12th, 2022. On this week's show, Sports Illustrated's Jon Wertheim will join us to talk about his longtime colleague and our friend Grant Wahl, who died suddenly over the weekend while covering the World Cup in Qatar. We'll also be joined by The Atlantic's Franklin Foer for a conversation about Morocco's thrilling run to the World Cup semifinals. And finally, we'll discuss Brittney Griner's long-awaited return to the United States after a prisoner swap with Russia. I'm in Washington, D.C., and I'm the author of The Queen and the host of the podcast 1 Year. Also in D.C. is Stefan Fatsis, author of the books Wild and Outside, Word Freak, and A Few Seconds of Panic. Hey, Stefan.
Hey, Josh.
And with us from California is Joel Anderson, host of Slow Burn Season 3 and 6. Hey, Joel.
Hey, Jeff.
We're all obviously in shock about Grant's death, and we're going to play a long conversation with Jon Wertheim coming up in a second. But I think we had just all wanted to pause before we start the show just to say, you know, how deeply we've been affected by this news. I mean, Stefan, you and I were just on a Zoom with Grant a week ago. We recorded that on Sunday after the U.S.-Netherlands game. And, you guys heard 20 minutes of that, our conversation about the game. But we also spent some time with Grant on that Zoom, Stefan, just talking about, how he was doing, life. And just to think that he's gone now is just unfathomable.
It is unfathomable. As I'll mention in our conversation with Jon, I knew Grant for 25 years. He was a colleague. We weren't close personal friends, but we interacted a ton at World Cups, men's and women's, on this show. He must have been a guest on Hang Up and Listen 20, 30 times over the years, Josh. A lot of people listeners sent a lot of really nice notes and comments over the weekend saying how much they enjoyed hearing Grant and how much they learned about soccer from hearing Grant and how they weren't fans of the sport except for Grant and listening to him on Hang Up and Listen. It's just a unspeakable tragedy, and our hearts are obviously extremely heavy, and our condolences go out to Grant's family, his wife, Celine Gounder, his brother, and the rest of his family.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I didn't know Grant as well as you all guys knew him, but to me, he was a legend, almost sort of a celebrity. I've been reading Grant Wahl since I was in college, and just the idea that we had access to him in this way was like a big thrill for me. And I know a lot of people sometimes comment or talk about, Joel's not a huge soccer fan or whatever, but I didn't grow up with soccer. That's just not, America is a different place. I grew up in a different neighborhood, a different culture, a different neighborhood, whatever. But his enthusiasm and his willingness to take people into the game and to talk about the culture and the personalities and everything else, at least as far as I'm concerned, probably the most important soccer writer of my lifetime, and that we had access to him, and that he was just so giving of his time and so generous and just a cool guy. Even in the moments when we're not recording, just to have those moments with him, man. I can't believe that they're over, but I'm glad that we really had them. And that this show is part of his archive, in a way. So I'm really proud of that. And, but yeah, to your point, Stefan, we're all up there too, man. Just, it just goes by so quickly. And it's just really sad. But I'm also a big believer that people get the eulogies they deserve. And seeing all the people come out and talk about him in the ways that they did over the weekend was just really uplifting in a way, in a really grim time.
Thanks, both of you guys, for those great words. And I think before we start the show, we should hear Grant's voice. So we're going to just put in a clip here from one of his recent appearances on our show that kind of shows Grant's personality, his clarity of vision, and we'll enjoy listening to him and wish we were able to talk to him again this week.
I personally, as a journalist, wanted to come here earlier in the year and do the reporting on migrant workers before I came in November and December, because I know what covering World Cups is like, because there's a ton of soccer. There's 4 games a day for the first half of the tournament, and I'm going to be spending a ton of time covering soccer. So I wanted to cover the other important things before the tournament started. And we'll see if any incidents happen during the tournament, protests from players or anything like that.
In our Slate Plus segment this week, we are going to talk about soccer and the news that came out on Sunday about Gio Reyna, the young American star who apparently almost got sent home from the World Cup because of his lack of effort in practice. To hear that segment, you need to be a Slate Plus member. You get extra segments on the show and other Slate shows. You get ad-free podcasts, and you get to support our program, which we very much appreciate. Slate.com/hangupplus to join. Slate.com/hangupplus.
1 month ago on a Sunday morning, I texted Grant Wahl asking if he could join us on the podcast the next day to preview the Men's World Cup. The only catch, it looked from his Twitter feed that he'd be en route to Qatar. Minutes later, though, Grant wrote back, "Hey, would 11:15 a.m. work?" He was at the airport in Toronto, his first stop from Newark, and then on to Cairo, and finally to Doha. A few hours after arriving at his rental house after a 24-hour journey, Grant's familiar bald head popped up on Zoom, and he delivered 20 minutes of thoughtful commentary about Qatar, human rights, and the U.S. national team. As we've read and heard in so many testimonials since he collapsed in the press box during the Argentina-Netherlands quarterfinal and died on Saturday at age 49, Grant was always there for others in the media. Whenever I asked him for a contact, for a player, or another reporter, he happily passed it along. He was a guest on this show many times. Some of our listeners commented over the weekend that they got to know Grant through his appearances here. Grant declined only when he knew he'd be on a plane. And when he did decline, he always suggested another soccer journalist, usually someone younger and less well-known, whom he wanted to support. That was Grant the colleague. Grant the reporter? Here's how Sports Illustrated executive editor John Wertheim described in a remembrance his office mate at the magazine in the late 90s. The greatest soccer writer of our generation, covering the world's biggest sport more like a foreign correspondent than a beat writer. John Wertheim is here now. John, thanks for coming on to pay tribute to our friend.
Thanks, guys. I can't believe we're doing this, but thanks for having me.
John, there were 2 things that stood out to me journalistically about Grant. One was his approach to a beat that over a quarter century he simply dominated. All of it was endlessly interesting to him. The teams, the players, the tactics, the politics, the fans, the culture. But he was open-eyed about soccer's many flaws and willing to take stands against its injustices. He was a loving critic and a critical lover. The other thing was his foresight. Grant saw before any of us, including those of us who were fans and reporters, that covering soccer could and should be a full-time job in America. Grant saw before any of us, including those of us who were fans and reporters, that covering soccer could and should be a full-time job in America.
Someone asked me recently about Grant, when did he pivot to soccer? And I said, oh, no. When he and I shared an office in the 90s, he would happily have dropped everything to be the full-time soccer writer. He saw this coming. He had all of these pitches. I can't believe we don't have more people at the MLS final. I can't believe we haven't done anything on there. There's this woman that plays for North Carolina whose name is Mia Hamm, and she has this coach, Anson Dorrance, who's a complicated figure. And he saw this wave coming. He saw this as underreported and underrepresented, and he would happily have started on day one covering soccer full time. He really saw around corners, and I think you're right. I think you really set that up wonderfully. I mean, I think he saw this as part of a bigger story, and he was fine with the X's and O's. I mean, Lord knows he tried to explain it to those of us who were Philistines, but what he really got was the culture, how this explained the world, the politics for good, for ill, men, women, globally. I mean, he really saw the games as sort of just a small part of a bigger tableau.
John, I had assumed that Grant grew up with the game, that maybe he had played it in college or at least in high school, right? You know, a guy with this breadth of knowledge and enthusiasm for the game, you feel like that's something you almost have to be born with to develop as a kid. But he didn't truly become a convert until a college trip in South America. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, about how he came to the game?
Yeah, Grant had a mentor in college, Gloria Emerson, the well-known journalist and war correspondent who really encouraged him to write and explore the world and write the kind of stories that he would do for the next 30 years. And he described it to me as a boondoggle, but he was an undergrad in college and went on a trip for credit to South America, to Argentina, and fell in love with soccer. He was from, he was from Eastern Kansas and knew a little bit about soccer, but I was laughing. I was, Googling some of these tributes, and I saw, was Grant Wahl a professional soccer player? And got a good laugh out of that one. He was not a professional soccer player. But no, he took this trip to South America, and I think he realized the power of soccer, the binding power, the richness of this. He went to, he snuck in and watched Boca Juniors, and he brushed up on his Spanish, and they gave him, he was the American college kid, and he walked out with a handful of scarves. And I think that experience in South America really had a profound impact on him. He was not a professional soccer player in an earlier life.
And the other piece of that, John, was that he joined the college paper, the Daily Princetonian. He wound up covering the men's soccer team, and the coach turned out to be Bob Bradley, who would go on to be U.S. national team coach. And they developed what sounds like a genuine sort of collegial relationship, but also sort of a mentor relationship when Grant was at Princeton, and Bradley encouraged him to pursue reporting on and researching soccer, particularly in South America.
Exactly. And some of that was, it was serendipity, it was good luck, but also I think it bears remembering just how small a speck soccer was on the sports landscape, certainly on the sports media landscape. It was Grant's, he talked about this a lot. It was sort of his good fortune that the guy he was covering after they played Brown and Dartmouth would end up being the national team coach. But it also didn't take him long to sort of develop this rich bed of contacts. And I think that, I think the Bradley family was instrumental in him getting started. And I think the very first main magazines back in this was the tail end of the golden age of magazines, like an ad would come in and they would need more edit pages. And he was hastily dispatched one day to go cover the women's NCAA final. Go ahead. This Mia Hamm woman, we don't know who you're talking about, but you seem really committed, that you really seem to think she's a story. Go to Chapel Hill, write the story, and, go on your way, kid. And that was really his first big break for Sports Illustrated. But within a few months later, he was going to, I think it was the first time he ever went to Europe. He was covering the World Cup in 98. He then covered the women's world. Again, very part of his story is just he was so prescient, not just with the growth of soccer, but where the story was, what the critical issues were, who the critical players would be, where the fissures were, where the growth areas were. And he gets back from France. He's absolutely giddy. He returns from this trip. It's his first trip to Europe. The home team wins. He's on the Champs-Élysées when the players are feted. And the first thing he says is, we've got to cover the women next year. There's a lot of talent involved here, but I think one of his talents was he was really prescient with both the sport and with the individual stories.
So there are so many stories that he wrote that I think were kind of like classically great journalism, the kind that you would teach in journalism school. Like most recently, the story that he did for his website where he went to Qatar months before the tournament and just went around to all the hotels and figured out how to speak to migrant workers, get them to trust him. He had these folks still talking to him on WhatsApp, which he talked to us about on our show, just about what they were dealing with in the country. Like he went there and got this story that so many people were speculating about, is how are workers treated. And it's the big picture story of this World Cup and the corruption around it. He figured out a way to tell it on the ground in this very kind of close up way. And we all benefited from that work. And so there's a kind of like orthodox great journalism there. But this was a guy who also ran for FIFA president. I think I had forgotten that until I was thinking about Grant and looking back at his work. And, you know, John, there have been so many appreciations for his generosity, his mentorship. But this is a guy who also kind of had an ego, like to run for the president of FIFA. And like, that's something that maybe we're not taught to do as journalists. Like he made himself the center of the story. And he was willing to do that when he thought something was right. And we saw that with him wearing the rainbow shirt to the World Cup game in this past few weeks. Like he was not afraid to whether it's, make himself the center of attention when he felt like that was necessary. And so I wonder if you have any kind of insight into the kind of person he was in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to distinguish. This wasn't, look at me, I want the dopamine rush of your attention. I mean, I think he was trying to make a point, both when he wore the shirt in Doha, but even when he ran for FIFA president, it was sort of, we need some integrity after all of this corruption. It wasn't sort of a publicity stunt. But no, I mean, Grant was very complex, and he wrote long form pieces, but also had this great social media presence. And, he had his Midwest background, but also his Princeton background. And he broke news, but he wasn't at all transactional. Deshaun Watson is improving because an anonymous source told me is completely offensive to him. And at the same time, he prided himself on being a newsbreaker as well. And as you say, he sort of had this Midwestern mensch side to him, but he also had this low threshold for moral outrage. I mean, there were...
He called out Sports Illustrated, John, when the new owners came in a couple of years ago, when Maven came in, and he was fired because of his outspokenness.
Exactly. And there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of people we sort of held your nose and hoped for the best. And Grant said, no, and went public with some of his dissatisfaction. And whether it was, equal pay for the men's and women's national teams, whether it was FIFA corruption, whether it was workers' rights abuses, Grant had a lot of opinions, and he was very accessible. All these stories about mentorship, I've seen this firsthand. I mean, he and I came up together. There was never anything remotely competitive about him. It was, as Stefan said, he was happy to give you his contacts. He was happy to, bounce story ideas off of him. And yet when something enraged him, when he found something offensive, he was not at all shy, both professionally and personally, about letting that be known.
He was methodical. He was prolific. And he was personally very direct. And I admired him for that. And he was also kind of a goofball. I mean, he washed his jeans by putting them in the freezer. He wore those goofy red, white, and blue headbands on his bald head when he would work out, shorts over running tights. He showed up for lunch with me and my wife and daughter in Lyon during the 2019 World Cup like he had just come out of the gym with the stupid headband on. He was a character. But all of that, I think, went into his persona. And what made him such a great journalist was his authority and his willingness to just go from story to story and idea to idea, all of it, as I said in the intro, endlessly fascinating to him, and all of it needing to be told.
There was a real versatility to him, and he would toggle from podcasting to doing short videos to doing long form. I mean, Josh, you mentioned the story he did on the workers. I mean, keep in mind, too, this was not done with the big budget of legacy media saying explore this and an editor guiding him. I mean, he effectively did this on his own dime. A lot easier to just fire off tweets and get the dopamine rush than to go report 5,000-word pieces on workers' rights abuses, especially when you're essentially doing this for your own site. But no, I think this is what helped him connect with people as well, that he would, he'd read The Economist, but he would also be able to quote Dumb and Dumber. And he owned, I don't think you guys would disagree. I think this is the most, this is the authority. This was the gold standard for covering the sport. This is the great soccer writer of our generation. But we've talked about that LeBron James cover. I mean, he and I met once in Oklahoma when he was doing I think it was a Derek Carr story. I mean, there was a real versatility to him professionally and personally as well. I think that helped him connect with people. I think that helped people trust him. And it's really been, to me, a great source of comfort that the world is discussing this and telling these stories. I just can't believe we're talking about this. I heard him on your podcast, it seems like a few days ago, and some of this is about output and outcome and the work he did and the quality, but a lot of this is about process too. And he was an Eagle Scout and sort of said it self-effacingly, but I think that's something that really informed his approach. And he didn't cut corners. There was a real integrity. There was a real thoroughness. I mean, he's as hard a worker. I don't think I've ever had a colleague work harder. We all know about his great work, but the fact that his process, the acts as well as the words, that's something that's been really meaningful to me these past few days.
I got to know Grant through this show, right? The first time I'd ever spoke to him was when he came on here. And I think I was floored when I found out that he was only a few years older than me, because given his byline in the assignments, I assumed he was about 20 years older than me. But he started at Sports Illustrated out of college. So that's like making the jump from high school to the NBA. And we're talking about SI during the heyday of Rick Riley, Gary Smith, William Knack, Michael Silver, all those guys, right? Right? Jeff Pearlman. Can you just sort of explain how difficult it was to get to Sports Illustrated in the 90s and then to thrive once you get that opportunity? Because we're talking about probably one of the golden eras of sports journalism, right?
Yeah, Grant had worked for the Miami Herald. He'd actually, I think, lived in Linda Robertson's, attic. And then he got this opportunity at Sports Illustrated to essentially come in as a fact checker. And they would dangle the occasional, this is sort of the bullpen and you can work your way up. And Grant took that risk and left the Miami Herald to come to Sports Illustrated. And I think he and I started within a few weeks of each other. And you would take any and all writing assignments you could get. But I think it became very clear very fast that he had voice, he had talent, he had instincts. He and I collaborated on a number of pieces when we were both sort of trying to break through and become full-time writers. And it wasn't just his work. I mean, his instincts as a journalist, knowing how to connect with sources, knowing the right questions to ask, sort of just being savvy and smart and ethical, but also efficient. He was just born to do this job. And it was, as you say, it was sort of the golden age of Sports Illustrated, and the money was flowing, and you had this full staff of writers. But also, Grant wasted very little time distinguishing. So, it was really clear he was going places, and he very, very soon became a full-time writer and didn't have to fact check.
And I think he recognized the opportunity, too. He knew he was good. At that 1998 World Cup, that's where I met him in the press box during the Iran-USA game. And we got to talking, and I was like, dude, you should come to the Wall Street Journal. We're starting a little sports department. And he was like, no, I think I'm good. I'll think about it. But he made the right call. I think he knew that he could rise quickly and that he had the talent, and I'm sure it was being encouraged by people at SI.
Yeah, exactly. I think, if you could do it again, you'd say, go cover this kickball sport full time. He covered college hoops for many years. had an opportunity to talk to Roy Williams recently, the first thing he said is, how's my buddy Grant Wahl? I mean, he made real inroads in college hoops. And again, having grown up, he was a huge, like Josh in LSU, he sort of had the same thing with Kansas, and he grew up in college hoops. But from the beginning, soccer was really his first love. And I think he just got it. I think he understood that this was a growth stock. He understood the richness of the stories, the men, the women, the internationalism. I think, again, if you could rewind the clock, you would have made him the full-time soccer correspondent in the late 90s and not 10 years later. But it worked out pretty well for him.
Joel, you had this experience with your friend Ed Ashoff a few years ago who died way too young, and just seeing the outpouring of both people who knew him and read his work, just saying the nicest things about him. And it would be great if folks could hear how we felt about them while they were still alive. And I think a lot of us do take that opportunity to tell people we read and care about that they mean a lot to us. But just seeing how much people appreciated Grant, both for his work and for the person he was, has been a really beautiful thing. And, John, he was in Qatar covering the World Cup, and, we were subscribers to his newsletter, and a lot of his daily updates, he would bounce around between the games, between the broader kind of cultural and political story, but also I'm so happy to be here with my friends, the community of domestic and foreign journalists that were kind of his tribe. And so, Chris Jones wrote about being in the press box with Grant, when he died, and he was surrounded by, people who loved him and cared about him and did the thing that he did. And he was just, for the last few years especially, I mean, you mentioned it, John, he was out doing exactly what he wanted to do, going to all the U.S. qualifiers, writing the story about FC Sheriff that he came on the show to talk about, going to Spain, being in Spain to write about Yunus Musa. Being at Leeds to write about the Americans there. He was just doing exactly what he wanted to be doing. And so it's really admirable. And it was great to hear about his adventures, as recently, just as, this past week when he was writing about what a great set piece goal the Netherlands had in that last game. And so, yeah, I'm sure you had the same experience, John, and kind of following what your friend has been up to the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's been a source of comfort that the word is out, and these stories sort of are endearing and poignant. Chris Stone, our former colleague, wrote a lovely piece for the LA Times and likened Grant to Anthony Bourdain. So someone said, well, he treated everyone the same. And I would even push back on that and said there was almost a tropism towards that. There was a real obligation he felt to be a mentor and to look out for people that did not have his level of status and access. And LeBron James had a lovely tweet, but what is just as poignant to me are all these people with whom we used to work who remember these small acts of kindness from 20 years ago. He was a big person. He was principled. He was ethical, but he really took great pleasure in sort of spreading the wealth. If that's his legacy sort of journalistically, but also as a human being.
He was also a huge champion of his wife's work, Celine Gounder, who's an epidemiologist and was on Biden's COVID response team at the start of his administration. And even before I knew her, who she was, he was always talking about, my wife, the doc, she's going to Africa, she's going here, she's going there. He was a great champion of her, too. And I think that said a lot about Grant and how he viewed his own work and the context that he placed his own life.
He also followed her, and she would go to Seattle, and he would go with her, and they lived in Boston, they lived in Baltimore, and when she was at NIH, and in South Africa, which is where he finished the one of his books. And he said, listen, as long as I have good Wi-Fi, this is a global sport, and I'm willing to wake up early, and they have these teleconferences where you don't have to go to the office. You can have a phone conversation right there on your laptop. There was a remarkable prescience to Grant, and he really saw around corners in a lot of ways. And one of them was realizing you could base yourself anywhere and cover a global sport. And the fact that these tributes have come from, he lived a few blocks away from me, and they've come from the neighborhood. They've come from Princeton and Sports Illustrated, but they've also come from the farthest corners of the world. That's testament to his impact, but I also think that's testament to how he saw the world and how small he thought, quite rightly, the world was and would be going forward.
We are all obviously devastated by what happened, but we will remember Grant fondly. But we will share on our show page some of his work and focus on what a contribution he made, not just to sports, but to our lives as a friend and as a colleague. John Wertheim is the executive editor of Sports Illustrated. John, thank you so much for coming on to talk about Grant.
Thanks. And you guys should know how much he always enjoyed talking to you guys.
Coming up next, we'll talk to Franklin Foer of The Atlantic about Morocco and the World Cup.
It's time to reboot your credit card with Apple Card. Now through December 25th, get 5% daily cash back on products at Apple with the new Apple Card, including a new iPhone 14 or Apple Watch Ultra. And everywhere else, Apple Card gives you up to 3% unlimited daily cash back on everything you buy. Apply now in the Wallet app on iPhone and start using it right away. Subject to credit approval. Monthly financing through Apple Card monthly installments is ineligible to earn 5% back. Additional exclusions apply. Valid only on qualifying U.S. purchases for new Apple Card customers who open an account and use it from December 1st to 25th, 2022 at Apple. Visit apple.co/save5 for more details.
The Men's World Cup semifinals are, as you probably know, all set. On Tuesday, Argentina and Lionel Messi, who's trying to win the tournament for the first time and cap his brilliant career, play Croatia, who are seeking a second straight finals appearance. On Wednesday, it's defending champion France against surprising, exhilarating, fun-making fan favorite Morocco. Morocco has been the story of the World Cup so far. The Atlas Lions already have dispatched Euro powers Belgium, Spain, and in a wild 1-0 win on Saturday, Cristiano Ronaldo's Portugal. In one of his final dispatches, Grant Wahl called it. Morocco is no fluke, he wrote, and despite Portugal's big 6-1 win over Switzerland, I think Morocco has a real shot at taking down Portugal to become the first African team ever to reach the World Cup semifinals. Franklin Foer joins us now. He is a staff writer for The Atlantic and the author of the now classic book, How Soccer Explains the World. He's contributing to an Atlantic newsletter about the World Cup called The Great Game, where he wrote a remembrance of Grant Wahl. Hey, Frank, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, before we jump into the tournament, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about Grant a little. You worked together on a new Amazon Prime documentary, Good Rivals, about the U.S.-Mexico soccer rivalry, which I happened to be watching when I received the tragic news. I didn't know until I read your piece that Grant had helped you get going on How Soccer Explains the World, another one of his important contributions to the journalism of the sport.
Probably one of his most minor. But when I met Grant, I called him fairly cold, just as I was getting started on How Soccer Explains the World, which was really a notion more than a project at that point. And I didn't know anybody in the world, and I knew, I was a fan, but not Grant Wahl, who was at that stage a young reporter at Sports Illustrated. And even from that very young age, Grant just came into the game at the right moment for Grant and the right moment for the game. Grant started at Sports Illustrated just as MLS was kicking off and just as the game was suddenly available to us all through cable television. We could watch the Premier League. We could watch the La Liga on a relatively regular basis. It wasn't just the Sunday morning PBS versions of the Bundesliga. And Grant was just, I mean, it was, I was worried he was going to treat my call in a competitive sort of way because the world of soccer journalism at that point was so small and constricted. Having somebody come in and enter it, I worried would trigger him, but because I didn't know him. And in fact, he poured open his Rolodex to me, was incredibly encouraging. And I can't say that I ever had a close personal friendship with him, but I would stay in touch with him over the years. And he was always just this cheerleader for everything and everyone associated with the game. And that's part of what he did was he was the best champion for U.S. soccer because he treated the game with journalistic rigor as well as collegiality and generosity. And his book on David Beckham, which I think is this seminal moment in the game where you have this Galactico coming to the United States to grace us with his presence, you would think that it would deserve some sort of hagiographic treatment. And Grant's book on the subject was anything but. I mean, it was this perfect classic window into MLS and everything that was wrong with what he deemed the David Beckham experiment. And I think the other thing, one last thing I'll say about Grant and his contribution to the game was that he was a brilliant chronicler of the women's game. And he really took the game as treated it with the same respect, the same rigor that he treated the men's game, which was not the way that U.S. soccer treated it. It was not the way that his colleagues in soccer journalism treated it. And, it's been very touching to watch the likes of Mia Hamm or Megan Rapinoe pay tribute to him in the aftermath, because I think that they know his contribution to the mainstreaming of American women's soccer better than anyone. And that's quite a legacy.
That was really well said, Frank. And what both you and Grant have understood and appreciated about soccer was there was a global game and how you kind of have a vantage to really see it all from America, to see it with a kind of critical distance. And this tournament, which had teams from all of the non-Antarctica continents in the round of 16, is just such a great encapsulation of that. And in all of kind of world sport, the kind of one of the great achievements that has not yet been achieved, greater than perhaps the Cubs or Red Sox winning World Series, is an African team winning the World Cup. And we're just a couple of games away from that. And so what have you seen from this Morocco team, both on the field, and what do you think the significance is of what they've achieved so far in this tournament?
I was just thinking back to Stefan and I watched the Euro finals, and it was 2004 when Greece won, and we watched it at a Greek restaurant on Connecticut Avenue together. And I think that is kind of the obvious point of comparison for a lot of soccer fans, that when you have a team that plays with just so much cohesion and such a sense of national purpose, just punching above their weight. I don't think going into this tournament, if you'd asked most pundits, like, which African team do you think has the best shot of pulling off this unlikely feat that you just described, Josh, I'm not sure Morocco would have been their number one pick. I think that Senegal was the team that people thought was kind of blessed with the most talent. It's interesting because this is an achievement that's not just an African achievement; it's an Arab achievement. And I think the fact that this tournament is taking place in Qatar, a fact that many of us decried for, I think, very sound moral reasons. There's this flip side to it, which is that having the tournament being played in an Arab nation, I think, does flip the home field advantage that Europe and South America tend to garner. It's such an exciting team to watch because there's this, you see this in every World Cup, that there's a team, whether it's Paraguay for me is like the quintessence of this model, where you have a team that just knows how to defend in a rigorous way that makes the type of defending that we would decry normally week in, week out as boring. They make it exciting. But on top of that, Morocco has layered on this kind of what I think is, I've seen it described as a swashbuckling quality, that when they counterattack, they don't just counterattack in ones and twos, they counterattack as a total team. And it's filled with like a stylishness and a joyousness and flicks and tricks. And I think that the goal that they scored against Portugal is probably one of the goals of the tournament, that towering header Al Nassiri scored. And so that makes them so much more exciting than what you would expect out of this genre of team.
It feels like there's obvious reasons why African teams have never advanced this far in the tournament, right? Like resources, the loss of players to other colonial nations, so on and so forth. But one thing Morocco has been able to do is that it's tied into, players across the diaspora. And I'm just curious to know, is that a replicable model? Like, is Morocco's emergence as simple as the strong play, timely breaks, and successfully reaching out to these players that might have some interest in playing for their parents or their grandparents' nation?
Well, I think it is, in fact, the model that like Senegal, Ghana tend to use, that they are successful in tapping into the Ghana, that most of these players who go to Europe at a very young age have multiple passports and they're wooed by multiple nations to play. I think what's interesting about Morocco is almost how impossible it would be to replicate what they've done. Because you look at their back line, it is the, to use a sports cliche, it's like the ultimate duct tape back line. To have a team that relies on defense, and they've now, Hakimi, I think, is their only regular starter in their back defensive line. Romain Saiss, their monstrous central defender who had played at Wolverhampton. Wolverhampton is now out. And so they've just been shot through with injuries. And it's the fact that you have these guys who, they have a right back who plays there's a left back who plays for Casablanca, and it's just kind of astonishing that they're doing this without even putting their kind of best talent forward.
And they have players that play for Chelsea and PSG, let's be clear. And that's one of the reasons that, as you were talking about, Joel, that a lot of the African teams can compete. And I think also one of the missing pieces is that the rest of the world doesn't recognize, particularly when you just show up at this tournament, maybe you watch soccer casually and it's like, oh, Morocco, that's crazy, or Senegal, that's crazy. How are they doing well? Well, they're doing well because of migration and colonization and resources of European leagues and teams taking players away from home, but developing them at the same time. And the challenge, as you mentioned, Joel, is how do you get those players to play for their home country? They're often very torn. And we see the same phenomenon with the United States national team too, Frank.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think what's exciting about this team is you have players like Hakim Ziyech, who, when he plays for Chelsea, is kind of assailed by Chelsea fans constantly for not pressing hard enough, and that there's like a certain profile that they've typecast on him. And here, playing for Morocco, where it's all an expression of kind of national pride and attachment to this nation, which is enmeshed in all of the complexities that you've just described, Joel and Stefan. I mean, that's the incredible thing. You just see this outsized effort that gets applied in this tournament, where these players who are fine players get cranked up to just this different level by part of the collectiveness of the whole enterprise.
And Josh, Ziyech didn't play for Morocco because he had a falling out with the previous coach, who was a European. Under a Moroccan coach, Ziyech has been reintroduced to the team just a few months before the World Cup and is thriving.
Yeah, and that's been another pleasing phenomenon, is African teams coached by African coaches at this World Cup, which is something that we really hadn't seen in previous generations, Frank. And also, I mean, it's just almost absurd the extent to which the kind of national character and the like political history of the nation is just at the fore in all of these games. I mean, Morocco is playing against all of these colonizers. I mean, Spain, Portugal, and now it's kind of the ultimate matchup is France. I mean, you couldn't, it would be absurd to have thought it would play out this way. But what are you looking for in that matchup between Morocco and France?
Well, first of all, word should be said for Morocco's Bosnian coach, who was sacked right before the tournament, Vahid Halilhodžić, who has been sacked 3 times. He's a mercenary coach who goes to different countries, Japan, Cote d'Ivoire. Now Morocco helps them qualify for the World Cup. And then I guess is apparently such an ass that he gets fired right on the edge of the tournament. He has fallings outs. But I love these games where, I mean, for me, part of the joy of a World Cup is just knowing that it's intertwined in history, it's intertwined in culture, it's intertwined in politics, and that when you have games, like when you had the game between Switzerland and Serbia, which you had all these Swiss players who were descendants of Albanian and Kosovar refugees playing against Serbia, this game, which carries the edge of history, and despite all of the complexities that we've just described about the diaspora and the relationship between the cosmopolitan center and the periphery of the empire, this is a game that has real meaning. You can't deny that there's an element of revenge that's there, and that will motivate the Moroccans. And who would bet against Morocco? I mean, after having watched them run through this tournament, France is an outstanding team. I mean, I think that they are technically the best team at the tournament, and they are a team that has had a coach, Didier Deschamps, that has imposed a system that just works for them. Antoine Griezmann, I think, has just been, everybody in the world knew he was a great player, but he's been just an absolute joy to watch at this tournament, playing this supporting role behind the French strikers. And Mbappe played a terrible game against England. They beat England, an excellent team, and Mbappe was really not getting into gear in that game. And so, but Morocco plays such a specific style of football, and they've shown themselves capable of stymieing other attacks, which are also excellent. So, you could put a gun to my head and I would make a prediction, but I would struggle to make that prediction.
All right, Frank is going to stick around for the bonus segment to talk about Gio Reyna and Greg Berhalter and the U.S. men's national team kerfuffle since their elimination. Until then, Frank Foer, author of How Soccer Explains the World, staff writer at The Atlantic. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Frank.
Thank you.
Next, we'll talk about WNBA star Brittney Griner's release from a Russian prison.
Hang Up and Listen is brought to you by Progressive. What's one thing that you'd purchase with a little extra savings? A weighted blanket, smart speaker, that new self-care trend you keep hearing about? Well, Progressive wants to make sure you're getting what you want by helping you save money on car insurance. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save more than $700 on average. Customers can qualify for an average of 6 discounts when they sign up. Discounts like having multiple vehicles on your policy. Progressive offers outstanding coverage and award-winning claim service. Day or night, they have customer support 24/7, 365 days a year. When you need them most, they're at their best. A little off your rate each month goes a long way. Get a quote today at Progressive.com and see why 4 out of 5 new auto customers recommend Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National annual average insurance savings by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2020 and May 2021. Potential savings will vary. Discounts vary and are not available in all states and situations.
In August, WNBA star Brittney Griner was sentenced by a Russian court to 9 years in prison for drug possession. By then, Griner had been in custody for nearly 6 months after police said they found vape canisters containing cannabis oil in her luggage at the Moscow airport. Griner's conviction happened during the invasion of Ukraine, a time of rapidly worsening relations between Russia and the West. The White House said then that they hadn't received a productive response from Russia about a potential prisoner swap. Fast forward to last month, when Griner was transferred to a notoriously brutal Russian penal colony about 200 miles southeast of Moscow. Hopes for an early return seemed grim. But last week, finally, the U.S. struck a deal with Russia to free Griner and send back Viktor Bout, a Russian arms dealer who once earned the nickname Merchant of Death. Josh, Griner's imprisonment became a sort of cause celeb because of the geopolitical ramifications, the efforts of the WNBA and its fans to keep her plight in the news, and the ongoing culture war over whether she was receiving preferential treatment over other American prisoners abroad. So what came to mind when you learned that Brittney Griner was being released?
That she's a person. That's kind of been lost a little bit in all of the geopolitical discussions and also kind of the back and forth about Paul Whelan being left behind and how this ended up being a 1-for-1 swap rather than getting all of the Americans who are wrongfully detained in Russia out. That this is someone who didn't deserve the treatment that she received and someone who on her flight back home, as the CNN story relates, just was clearly desperate for any kind of human contact and connection. The special presidential envoy for hostage affairs, Roger Carstens, was talking about how on this flight she spent 12 of the 18 hours just talking to everyone on the plane, asking about who they were, expressing her gratitude that she was able to get home. And Stefan, I think because this story became so big, so infused with kind of political and cultural meaning, I think that this very tall woman kind of got lost in the shuffle sometimes and became more of an idea than the person that she is. And just seeing her wife Sherelle and hearing about, these first moments of freedom that she felt is just very kind of personal and very human, and all the kind of political and cultural baggage just sort of melted away from me there.
Yeah. The fact that she was an athlete obviously is central to the entire conversation and why we're discussing her and have discussed her previously. This is a 6'9" gay black woman. And the most appalling thing to me in all of this is obviously A, Griner's treatment in Russia, and B, the way she's been treated as a talking point on the right and criticized for who she is. Let's not forget, she was arrested by Russian authorities for allegedly having some cannabis oil in her suitcase, in a bag. She's not a political prisoner. She wasn't any sort of government official. She wasn't involved in any arms trade. This was an athlete who was trying to make money by playing overseas, which women's basketball players still need to do in this country. And her career is going to be something that we'll talk about in a few minutes and will be the subject of conversation, I think, going forward. But, to me, it's also just the risks for American athletes and star athletes who have to go overseas to earn a living. I think that's the one thing that has stuck with me from the outset.
The timing of this is really interesting because I'm always thinking about the idea that the WNBA itself, and particularly the Atlanta Dream, may have been instrumental in flipping the balance of power in the U.S. Senate. Like, remember, they pushed out Kelly Loeffler and elevated Raphael Warnock. And since then, Raphael Warnock has won 4 consecutive elections to remain in the Senate. So Brittney Griner comes out of that league. And there are people that will already be sort of skeptical, and that's at best, about people out of that league. But if you look at her, she's easy to hate if you're inclined to go in that way. She's black. She's a lesbian, a native Houstonian. Easy to mock because of her height and appearance, and someone who was once publicly critical of American government during the height of the George Floyd protests. So when she was released, I knew immediately that it was going to go in this way, which is sort of sad because it used to be a big deal, something that everyone could rally around when a political prisoner, an American political prisoner, was released from a hostile foreign country. We used to celebrate that, but not anymore. And I know that, nothing is really new under the sun. America has always been the country. Like, I don't believe that political division is new or any of that bullshit. Like this, I mean, ask my grandfather about what the political division was in this country, in the 1940s, right? But Brittney Griner is from a league and a group of people that are already sort of reviled on the right, and she didn't get the benefit of the support that she deserved. And I think that's really sad because it cast a pall over something that should have really been a national moment for us, that everybody should have really been able to celebrate that. And instead, it's devolved into something else, which is fairly predictable, but it doesn't mean that we should talk past it or overlook it, because it's still, I'm not going to say it's unprecedented, but it's nearly that. And it's just really sort of depressing, Josh, because like you said, Josh, I mean, she's a person. She's a person that got caught up on trumped up charges, and it just doesn't seem that the homecoming is what it could have or should have been. But at a minimum, I'm happy that she's home, and that she can decide what she wants to do from here.
Yeah, it's unclear when or if she'll resume her WNBA career, and what a decision that is, and what it would be sort of remarkable, wouldn't it, to see her on a basketball court. And just, I guess, the idea of her becoming the Brittney Griner that we would talk about on this show because she was doing basketball things, it seems kind of far-fetched at this point. Like everything that she does from now on in her life, she'll be the woman who was, held captive in Russia.
Didn't you find it moving that when you read that she didn't even want a basketball, that she could have had a basketball in prison and declined because she just figured that I'm probably not going to be needing that for a while, right?
Totally. And the league, the WNBA, and the NBA as well, but the WNBA sort of most forcefully was just so consistent in the message, both kind of publicly and I think privately, towards her, that she wasn't going to be forgotten. That one of the, I think it's 144 players in the league was gone. So they were, holding her spot. Like her spot is available for her to reclaim if she wants to. But Stefan, I mean, we're kind of thinking here off the top of our heads, but I really can't think of an example off the top of my head. I mean, it would be like, I don't know. I don't want to just say something that's like a really poor analogy, but just to have her kind of come back, play for the Mercury or whoever, maybe dunk, and she'll be on SportsCenter because she can dunk. It just seems kind of absurd to imagine that she'll ever just be regarded as oh man, I can't believe she didn't box out in that, cost them a game or whatever.
Sports culture in America has a pretty short memory. I mean, one parallel might be athletes returning from war. Athletes returning from injury feels trivial.
It would be like if Colin Kaepernick came back. I mean, there's obviously a lot of key differences there.
Or Pat Tillman.
Right.
Like if Pat Tillman had come. It's not prison, but you know what I mean? But
I mean, there are definitely, I can envision a scenario where she is celebrated as she should be when she comes back and gets back on a basketball court. She'll be a hero.
She could play in the Olympics, which would be quite a scene if that were to ever happen.
Absolutely. But the thing about her potential return that I think is most gratifying is something that you guys brought up, which is the way that the WNBA and the NBA had a consistent message and rallied around her. and supported her. And we can say that, tweeting is not terribly significant in a situation like this, but it was a way to galvanize the players, and it was a way to keep public focus on it. And it was handled, I think, in what seems to be in an extremely coordinated and safe way through the government, through the State Department. And whether that pressure mattered in terms of putting pressure on the Biden administration to work out some sort of deal, even one that might not be palatable to every political analyst, or whether keeping her profile high internationally put some sort of pressure on the Russian government to know that they weren't dealing with someone who would be forgotten. I don't know, but ultimately it worked.
It could have worked to the benefit of the Russian government, that they were able to extract better terms because of the pressure and because she was high profile. But that's not a reason that people shouldn't have kept her name out there and kept it alive. I mean, it's crazy to think that a basketball player got traded for an arms dealer. But that is the deal that was struck. We're not professional hostage negotiators. And, she is an extremely high profile person. She's somebody that it was a propaganda victory for Russia that they detained her. And it's a great thing that she's back and she's free. And her wife spoke very movingly at that press conference about how they are both going to use this experience to try to help other people in the same situation. So
it's certainly conceivable, Joel, that, that Brittney Griner could choose not to play basketball again. Maya Moore stepped away from the WNBA for a political cause. The profiles that a lot of the WNBA players have gained in the last few years have centered on political protest. So I don't think we have any idea of, what mental, physical condition Brittney Griner is in and what her interest level is right now. I mean, she's been home for, less than 100 hours or whatever. It doesn't feel like basketball is terribly important, but it is important in as much as it's her identity and it's her strength and her power.
And additionally, it is a source of income because it's not just the WNBA. Keep in mind, the reason she's going to Russia is to make up for the money that she otherwise can't make domestically, right? And I'll be sort of interested to know what happens with female basketball players who want to play overseas and in Russia going forward. There's been a lot of talk about, if the WNBA, raises the salaries, then maybe that will prevent that. And I think, Bomani Jones is the person who mentioned this recently, that, hey, man, if the WNBA offers $2 million, that's not really enough to stop taking money from overseas. Like, you still may want that other $2 million out there. So, beyond the geopolitical considerations, beyond the personal considerations, it also has, reverberations for people, all the other female basketball players that are going overseas and making their money in this way. Like, what can be done to make that not necessary anymore? And I don't know what that is. It may not be possible, but it's interesting to hear people talking about it at least.
Lionel Messi is arguably soccer's biggest star, but winning the World Cup has always eluded him. Now he's facing his final battle to bring back the title to his home country of Argentina. Listen how on NPR's new podcast, The Last Cup. Much more than a sports story, The Last Cup is a tale about confronting age and human limitations, a story about loyalty, identity, and what his journey reveals about us. Hosted by Argentine journalist and NPR correspondent Jasmine Garsd, The Last Cup is a dual-language narrative podcast focused on Messi's memoir. In what's expected to be Messi's final World Cup, the podcast will explore themes of capitalism, immigration, class, and race. The show explains who Messi is as a player to the European leagues, and who he is as a player to Argentina, his native country. Even if you know nothing about soccer, this podcast will hold your interest by showcasing history alongside a personal narrative. The Last Cup isn't just a podcast for Messi fans, it's for all sports fans. Anyone who loves stories of competition, team pride, and the legacies we leave behind. Check out The Last Cup from NPR and Futuro Studios. Find it in NPR's embedded podcast feed.
And now it is time for Afterballs, sponsored by Bennett's Prune Juice, endorsed by Kenny Sailors, who says, it's okay. This week, the Afterball is going to be named after Paul Silas, the former NBA player, coach, who died over the weekend at 79. Actually, his son, Stephen Silas, is currently the coach of the Houston Rockets. And look, a lot of people probably didn't come to Paul Silas until he was an older man, head coach of a bunch of different teams, including your team briefly. Josh, isn't that right? Yeah. Anyway, people may not know this, and this may be in the last time that Creighton was interesting to watch in basketball, but Paul Silas, Creighton basketball great, averaged 20 points and 21.6 rebounds per game at Creighton, voted into the College Basketball Hall of Fame, went on to become a 5-time All-Defensive Team NBA selection, averaging about like a 10-10 in 16 seasons in the league, playing with the St. Louis and Atlanta Hawks, Phoenix, Boston, Denver, and Seattle. He won 2 titles with the Celtics. And when he turned 36 and retired, he was then the NBA's oldest player. Think about how much things have changed since then. So look, I remember Paul Silas as a big, intimidating man, a guy who I think challenged Ira Newble to a fight once. Does that ring a bell?
Haven't thought about the name Ira Newble in a while.
Yeah, right. Ira Newble didn't want any of old man Paul Silas, who I figured probably still remained pretty tough and maybe could have even averaged double-digit rebounds if he still was in the NBA. So let's give it up for old Paul Silas. And Josh, what is your Paul Silas?
So Paul Silas was LeBron James's first NBA coach. With the Cleveland Cavaliers. And that's appropriate with this Afterball. Grant Wahl wrote dozens of cover stories in his 24 years at Sports Illustrated, many of them about soccer. But as we talked about with John Wertheim, he also wrote about college basketball and about one basketball player who skipped right over college. Among the many people who expressed their condolences about Grant's death was LeBron James, the subject of his 2002 Sports Illustrated cover story, The Chosen One, written when LeBron was still a high school junior. LeBron said this weekend, "I'm very fond of Grant, and having that cover shoot, me being a teenager and him covering that, it was a pretty cool thing. And he was always pretty cool to be around. He spent a lot of time in my hometown of Akron covering me over the course of time before that cover story came out." Reading that story now, I went back and looked at it over the weekend. It's clear that Grant did spend a lot of time in Akron, and that back then, when he was in his late 20s and LeBron was a teenager, Grant had an eye for the telling details that would help introduce the world to an American icon. Some of those details are just funny in their extraordinary 2002-ness, like LeBron checking his two-way pager for a message from Sebastian Telfair. What a 2002 sentence that was. But there's one passage that feels especially poignant today about LeBron's decision to play football on his high school team, ignoring the risk of injury. Grant wrote, "At first, LeBron's mother, Gloria, refused to let him play last fall. But after the 22-year-old singer Aaliyah died in a plane crash last August, he persuaded her to let him play. You're not promised tomorrow," LeBron says. "I had to be out on the field with my team." The big scene in the story that Grant captured is a Cavs game. And this was before, obviously, LeBron played on the Cavs. But they went to the game together. Cleveland was playing against Michael Jordan's Wizards, a team close to Joel's heart. And Grant watched as MJ and Bron greeted each other after the game with a warm, we're old pals handshake. He also saw an 11-year-old kid asking for LeBron's autograph, and then Browns coach Butch Davis joking with LeBron about helping out the team by playing wide receiver for the Browns, and maybe just in the red zone. Grant wrote that LeBron exists in a weird netherworld between high school student and multimillionaire, between dependent child and made man. There's a hint of concern in the story about shark circling. At that point, when LeBron was 17, much of his life had been unsettled. Grant notes that the man that LeBron then called Dad, Eddie Jackson, who was his mother's then partner, had pleaded guilty earlier in his life to cocaine trafficking. And Grant writes about how Jackson and Gloria James crisscrossed the country listening to sales pitches from corporate sponsors and Adidas and Nike representatives. But I was heartened, but not surprised, to see that there wasn't a hint of judgment in Grant's writing. The one moment that's going to stick with me is from that Cavs game they went together. Here's what Grant wrote. During a Cavaliers timeout, LeBron frantically waved his arms as the rally crew shot plastic mini basketballs into the crowd. He eventually snagged one, which he was still clutching when he met Jordan after the game. It's a great image, and I can just imagine Grant standing there and watching it all happen and being happy that he was there to see it. And if I had to guess, I bet he never forgot it.
That was lovely, Josh. Yeah.
That's really touching. Yeah, man.
I mean, the amazing thing about looking at those stories from 20 years ago is how they hold up. And it sounds like this really holds up.
A lot of credit to LeBron for that. And Grant, I think he has talked about it a lot over the years and recognized that he was lucky to be there in that moment. And, Joel, you've written a lot of stories, a lot of features over the years, and especially about athletes who can cover people with promise, and that promise, sometimes, a lot of the time, not their fault. It's just not fulfilled. But, we're lucky sometimes to be there at a particular moment and see something pretty magical.
I'm thinking about, in the same time that Grant Wahl is doing that for Sports Illustrated, writing about LeBron, same year, I'm down in Texas doing a profile on Kendrick Perkins and calling him the next Shaq. Hey, sometimes,
they're both on NBA, television as commentators. That's what you meant, right?
They both have a legacy. They both have kept their spot in the game, such as it is. So, yeah, that's a testament to not only Grant's prescience, but also a little bit of my, a little bit too much hype. I'm surprised the AP let me put that in there. But anyway.
That is our show for today. Our producer is Kevin Bendis. To listen to past shows and subscribe or just reach out, go to slate.com/hangup, and you can email us at hangup@slate.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. For Joel Anderson and Stefan Fatsis, I'm Josh Levin. Remember Zelmo Beatty and Grant Wahl. And thanks for listening. This episode is brought to you by Best Buy. Whether you're searching for exciting gifts or trying to snag the hottest holiday deals, Best Buy is here to help. From air fryers for the aspiring foodies in your life to smartwatches your fitness friends will love, Best Buy is your gifting destination for everyone on your list. And Best Buy makes it easy to get your gifts how and when you need them, with free next-day delivery on thousands of items, as well as same-day delivery and in-store pickup options. Shop great deals on gifts now at Best Buy.